Since its independence in 1991, Estonia has transformed itself into a digital nation and a European tech center. But how did that happen? We were fortunate to have Dan Bogdanov, head of R&D at Cybernetica, also a professor at the University of Tartu, and an inventor of ShareMind's privacy-enhancing technology solution, as our guest. Cybernetica is an Estonian IT company with a strong focus on research and development. It creates secure technologies for mission-critical systems and had an integral role in establishing the e-government ecosystem in Estonia. That includes digital identity, interoperability, internet voting. Now, I've been meaning to get into Estonia on the podcast for some time, and so much so that when I approached Dan, we decided to do 2 episodes. One, to focus on Estonia as an encrypted economy, and Cybernetica's role in that, and then shifting over to his work on ShareMinds and privacy-enhancing technology generally. And we'll be publishing that part of the episode in 2 weeks. So I bring a bit of my intro into the main episode because I wanted to set the stage for that discussion. So I'll leave it here. Last note, a few acronyms. PKI is simply Public Key Infrastructure, and RSA was one of the first public key infrastructure systems used. If you enjoy this podcast, please, as I always say, share, share, share. Thanks so much. And with that, I bring you Dan Bogdanov. Welcome to The Encrypted Economy, a weekly podcast featuring discussions exploring the business, laws, regulation, security, and technologies relating to digital assets and data. I am Eric Hess, founder of Hess Legal Counsel. I've spent decades representing regulated exchanges, broker-dealers, investment advisors, and all manner of fintech companies for all things touching electronic trading with a focus on new and developing technologies. Hi, this is Eric Hess with The Encrypted Economy. Today we have Dan Bogdanov, who's the head of R&D at Cybernetica and the co-inventor of ShareMind, a database with built-in non-disclosure agreements to secure data. He leads a team of researchers in development, specializes in secure multi-party computation, privacy-preserving data analysis, and software architecture. He is a PhD in informatics and a master's in computer science from the University of Tartu. Welcome to the podcast, Dan.
Thank you so much, Eric, for having me here. I'm very excited about the discussion we're going to have today.
Yeah, so I'm actually going to start the podcast a little differently. I'm going to drag a little bit of my intro just to sort of set the stage for my own fascination with Estonia and Cybernetica and sort of what brought us to this place. A number of years ago, working for a number of digital asset companies, trying to find appropriate jurisdictions, happened upon Estonia. But Estonia was very different than some of the other jurisdictions I was looking at in that it required a little more engagement from an Estonian to form that kind of company from offshore, which was a factor in limiting us. But it also was, in retrospect, an indicator of how Estonia views partnerships. And if you're going to come to our economy, we want to work with you. We welcome not just digital assets, but really all things encrypted. There's a strong focus on encryption and privacy at the government level and at the private level, and a real push to sort of drive that in the economy. And I brought it into the introduction because in many ways, Estonia is the encrypted economy that my podcast is about. I feel like they could be the model for other countries looking to do similar things. It just makes me very excited to have this podcast. So welcome, Dan, as a head of R&D at Cybernetica and also somebody who's actively involved in the government there. Not Cybernetica being involved in the government, public-private partnerships. So Dan, before we get into the rest of the podcast, why don't you give us a little bit about your background?
Indeed. So I started using computers at an early age. My father brought me a Commodore 64 during around the formative age of 10, and I learned to do some basic programming pretty much after that. And that became a lifelong hobby and interest, which made me write computer games for various platforms and build the sort of manual skills needed to build software. So as a logical follow-up, I went to the university to study computer science and did a bit of work on the side, worked on things like healthcare systems, and that gave me a good understanding of the privacy and security aspects of any data-driven system. So I decided to take my research towards cryptography. For my master's thesis, I have a first draft of the ShareMind secure multi-party computation system, which I then continue to work on for the PhD. And also, I've been working on privacy technologies and security technologies ever since. So, been a computer user since an early age and have some academic degrees to prove it.
I talked a little bit about Estonia. Maybe, we should start off really talking about the history of Estonia and why did Estonia take the lead on cryptography and e-digitization? Like what made it a prime country to do so?
There were multiple aspects, and people are still figuring those out. And the hypotheses and theories vary, depends on who you talk to. But consider for a moment, after 1991, when Estonia regained independence from the Soviet Union, we were at a situation where we almost had no significant technological legacy when it came to IT. And that was a bit of a boon, really. That was a good thing, because we could start building things from scratch based on the techniques that were already available. So there were institutions like the Institute of Cybernetics at the Estonian Academy of Sciences, which was a sort of a governmental, let's say, technology lab where various new technologies were prototyped, proofs of concepts built, research papers written, and so on. And you could say that Cybernetica as a company is a spin-off of that Academy of Sciences lab. Because the people who wanted to build practical things in 1997, 24 years ago, founded Cybernetica, the company. Around that time, we started reading cryptography books and started thinking of how the future of a digital nation should work. What are the security fundamentals? So our development leaders back then started thinking about how a digital government should operate. How should data exchanges be built? And while obviously we had some foreign systems to look at, there was PKI, there was already things like RSA and all of that. That was a given. We still started thinking about how does that work organizationally. So in some of the early research papers published at that time, we see the foundations of the X road, the whole idea of distribution, how you don't have to pull data together, how you can make data services interoperate between government agencies, how you can connect the silos, as some like to say. So that is the context. People started reading up on the state of the art and decided that we'll use the state of the art to build the digital Estonia, the E-Estonia.
And is there sort of a unified view in government to push the E in Estonia forward? Is it a very progressive government from a technological perspective?
Well, back then it was like bleeding edge progressive, I would say. These days, every time the government tries to, seems to fall behind a bit, then there's sort of a societal uproar in the media saying that, the Estonian IT tiger is falling asleep again. And then, yes, again, they have to start building things and updating things. But there is now also significant competition. There are many countries building some of the types of services that Estonia hasn't built yet. So currently, the focus of the government here is building proactive services, meaning services you will need, but you don't still know it yet. But at some point, the government will come to you and say, right, you are in this sort of situation. Maybe it's an age-based trigger, but you might need that level of support. Here are the forms, you can fill them out. But the government comes to you and says that, yes, you should do this. Estonia is not the first country to do this. There are now also others. So the competition has really picked up, and we're very happy it has, because then there's a lot more to learn, there's a lot more to share. There are full conferences where leaders of countries, ministries working on IT are coming to the Tallinn Digital Summit, as it is called, to exchange views, see which kind of open source projects are interesting, and how everybody else is funding all of this, what's the latest on securing this, the cybersecurity aspects and all. So yes, I would say that the government continues to be progressive and continues to invest. It's also because of a clear need, because so much of the system is digital that you have to keep it working.
I know when we had Tom Atima from TNO on the podcast, he talked a bit about that very thing, in terms of using, I guess, privacy preserving models to take in citizen data in a way that the people would be comfortable with, but also using it as a tool to deliver need-based resources based on the analysis of data in a way that wouldn't violate their privacy rights, GDPR compliant and the like. So that model is very interesting. And Estonia has a couple of things that it's really pressed hard within this country. One being this notion of E-Residency, another one being e-voting. Do you want to share a little bit about what Estonia has done in that regard?
Certainly. Just to follow up on that privacy thing, then there is a project we are currently getting to the conclusion toward, which is the use of artificial intelligence in e-governance. And there, some of the core things that we have been working on are how do you build models based on a population and then use it to make the work of a government agency more efficient, or to make the life of a citizen better. So this is something we're heavily working towards, and there have been some, rather obvious findings, which is that technology can't solve ethics. So sometimes you can't go to a person and say that, hey, a computer model says that you might be out of a job soon, and maybe you should be getting unemployment benefits. Here's the forms. And the person might get a total shock out of this. So that is something that will be a balancing point even with technology. But coming back to your question around internet voting and residency, internet voting is one of the more, some would say, controversial services available in Estonia. And indeed, internet voting is heavily used. First, to understand what does it mean, it means that people can vote for local elections, in local elections for their municipalities, for parliament. They can vote using a computer wherever they are. They don't need to go to a polling station. They can be elsewhere. It's like mail-in votes, but doing it synchronously over the internet. And that is a technology enabled by a pervasive use of digital identity, approved government-supported digital identity, which gives a really good level of assurance that a certain person is indeed who they claim they are. And internet voting, it has reached like up to 40% in recent elections, meaning that 40% of votes are coming in over the internet from people's computers. And we've been doing it for over 10 years now. Obviously, the early versions of that technology were a lot more basic than today's versions are. We've significantly improved the protocols, given that the attacks have become more mature. And you can now validate your votes on a separate mobile device, because it's not reasonable to expect that your computer you're using to give a vote is a secure device to verify it on. So the idea is to have a separate device, which hopefully isn't corrupted in any way, because your computer might have a virus, but then the phone won't, hopefully, because corrupting two devices of the same person at the same time is just so much harder. So this is how we've been working on this, developing internet voting as a technology. We're up to our, how many iteration, fifth, sixth, something like that, and the development goes on. E-Residency is another recent innovation which allows citizens of other nations to do business in Estonia. One could make the analogy of sailing on the seas. If you have a ship, then the question is, under which country's flag are you sailing? So the question with e-residency is, you might have a company under the Estonian flag. and you are operating that company under Estonian laws, Estonian business, but you're not a natural Estonian citizen. You're an e-resident, going for like electronic, digital. The onboarding process for becoming an e-resident is pretty significant. You have to give Estonia sufficient grounds of trusting who you are. And thus, it is available to many countries in the world, but the process still takes a while. But once you've done that, then it becomes possible for you to have a business in the European Union and run it from abroad, using the digital signatures, using mobile ID, the smart ID, the authentication channels available. You can interact with the government fully digitally. You can interact with the bank fully digitally as well. So that is something which has brought a lot of companies to Estonia. Some of them, not all of them, have been fully honest, and these have been found when they are trying to do something that's illegal. Then obviously this is not what the e-residency program was for. It is in no way designed to be a sort of a haven for illegitimate uses, but it is instead a showcase of what is possible if you build your technology just right. And this circles back to what you said in the beginning, that Estonia might in some ways be a model. Cybernetica does a lot of work internationally. We build up systems, digital ID, e-government technologies in various countries in Asia, Europe, Middle East, Africa, South America. And we see that we can't be a model for everyone, because countries are actually different. The governance models are different. The maturity levels are different, meaning that in some places they can take certain parts of what Estonia uses. But we do not think that cloning Estonia as a whole country is a reasonable course of action for most of the states on Earth. So instead, we look at what they have, what they need, and then we try to put things together from pieces. And it might be that certain things that work in Estonia do not work in other countries, and we are very mindful of that, and then we do not force them on anybody.
So we'll double click a little bit more on e-voting, but before and e-residency. But before we leave e-residency, has Cybernetica been involved in the e-residency program with the government?
To a limited degree, certain amount of consulting, reporting, but it has been driven by other great people.
So in terms of the e-residency, what would be the difference between, I guess, forming a foreign entity, forming a company in Estonia? I don't know if the participation of an Estonian citizen is still required. What would be the difference between that and e-resident?
Right. So let me give you a sort of an ideal scenario. Key about this that is not always obvious is that a lot of things can be done over the internet digitally using Estonian e-government services. Founding a new company, if you have your papers at hand, is done under an hour in Estonia. You can found a new company. Somebody actually did it in 18 minutes, so they did a speed run. But the point is that this is something that's available to you. You're sitting in a cafe and you're founding a new company for the business idea you just got with a friend 15 minutes ago. And this is what you can do. If you have the access to that digital identity, your contract with the government, they know who you are, you're founding a new company, you may have access to a certain level of banking already, and you can do that. And this is not always clear, because otherwise, obviously, you can come to Estonia, you can show who you are, you can start convincing the local boards that you want to found a company here, and you are going to be a foreign national while doing so, and all. But the point here is that you do the e-residency thing in one of the Estonian embassies, for example, and then you're good to go. There are certain parts in the banking sector which certain extra hurdles that you might have to jump through, because the anti-money laundering controls are pretty strict, and these still need to be enforced. However, this is still the level of ease that we've implemented in running a business from abroad is, I do believe, unprecedented.
Right. So to draw the distinction, as I understand it, because I've formed a number of companies overseas, and typically, particularly these days, there's a due diligence process for each company you seek to form. There are gatekeepers, which are the law firms or some entity formation. And once you've gone through the gatekeepers, it could be more easy. But the gatekeepers are effectively almost like an agent. They'll say, I want 3 forms of ID. I want your passport. I want a recommendation from your banker. I want, a lawyer, an accountant to sign off on these things. I want very detailed information. And, it's a bit of a hurdle. And if I want to then say, okay, I want to form another company, I sort of have to do the same thing. I kind of have to use the same, I might be able to leverage some of the prior materials, but I still have to go through, a gatekeeper to do it. What it sounds like is that if with the E-Residency, once I've sort of established myself as a founder, let's say a founder of a company, I've applied for E-Residency and I've been granted it, it's easier for me to then, I'm basically plugged in. It's sort of like I'm in the US, I want to form an entity in the US. That process is always simpler than forming an entity overseas, but because there's I'm already plugged into the system. I can leverage everything. I don't have to go through the same process. Where the gatekeepers, it's relatively easy for a U.S. citizen. My understanding from what you described is that relative ease would now exist as if you were an Estonian citizen trying to do the same thing.
Yes, that is exactly. It sort of bootstraps you into the same digital economy that we are running here. You don't get immediately the same rights. There are certain constitutional things we do not provide to e-residents. And then there's the next question of whether you get healthcare, whether you get to put your kids to school and so on and so on. But that's sort of future work for that program. The initial design is indeed to run businesses, within the European Union, which is a pretty good place to run certain businesses in. And ease of access is probably, let's say, the overhead of running an EU business from Estonia using e-residency is probably one of the lowest. And the issue of gatekeepers is especially strong here because efficiently there are rules. If you're given a computer form, you're given an online service, a website, which tells you what you need to show, what you need to do. It's sort of a digital gatekeeper, you could say. However, it's highly automated, and the people in the back end, while they do check for the identity checks and the checks of your trust have also been done when you applied for the e-residency. Once we've established that, then we assume you're good. We put certain trust in your ability to protect the tokens, the identity tokens that Estonia gives you. And given that you do that, then afterwards we we accept you as one of ours, let's say, to say very bluntly, I guess. The financial side, how much you had to pay for all of that, that's also sort of not at the whim of an agent of some sorts. Obviously, there are already consultancy companies which make the whole let's found a company while you are an e-resident thing easier. They also handle the accounting and reporting for you. So there is already an economy around providing support services for e-residents running companies. And that also is like an extra additional layer of ease on top of that, because they also handle your accounting for you and everything. So sort of you can find a one-stop shop these days that does something like that.
Excellent. And then now switching back to e-voting. Now, I think from what I recall, Cybernetica was more involved in the construction of the e-voting, correct?
Correct. So we came up. We've been building the Estonian e-voting system since its genesis, pretty much. The first protocols were rather easy. They would, well, if you can imagine like a mail-in vote, you vote for someone, you put the name down on a piece of paper, you put it in an envelope. You do not sign the envelope, and you put the envelope in another envelope. You sign the external envelope. So that's the sort of an idea. If you would like to then tally the votes. When you you collect the envelopes, you look at the envelopes, check if it's a valid voter. If it is, you take out the internal envelope and put it in the polling box. And then you can open the box and count the votes, but you won't have the names on them anymore. So that's exactly what was implemented in the first version of internet voting using standard cryptography, public key asymmetric cryptography. The internal envelope is encryption. You encrypt the vote, and then you digitally sign the encrypted vote. During tallying, you just check the signatures and you throw away the signatures. And in the box, you just put the encrypted votes. And then at some point, you open the box and decrypt the votes and check. So that was the first protocol implemented. You could explain it to your grandmother back then. These days, it's all about mixnets, bulletin boards, zero knowledge proofs, and all of that, because you have a lot more threats you want to defeat. You want to trust a lot less people. Trust against the government has been something that Estonia really has had. When we regained independence, when trust against the government was rather high, then the government could get away with a lot of things in a positive way, I would say. These days, as maturity increases, people understand things better. The distrust against certain government agencies can also grow. And thus, building protocols that allow you to trust the government less is a worthy design goal. So that's where we are aiming for now. Building protocols that allow you to trust your government less. And that's a sort of a driving point under some of our privacy work as well, that even if the government says that they will build a COVID-19 contact tracing system, then it would be really nice if they build one that they cannot repurpose as a surveillance platform later once the epidemic has passed, for example, things like that. So there's a whole thinking about how big infrastructural pieces do you want to build using computers. And the internet voting is a significant piece because arguably it can significantly change outcomes. Obviously, there's a lot of discussion on, I don't know, can your neighboring countries, for example, certain large ones to the east of Estonia, meddle with your votes and change the outcomes and get friendly parties to power? And these risk analyses have been done, both from an economic standpoint and then from a non-rational standpoint as well. And there is a clear understanding that this is something that we're doing now. There's also a social aspect here. If you want to get people to the polling stations, young ones, folks who are used to the new style of living where things are digital, you can get everything from the internet and so on, then voting is just another thing that works for them. And it allows them to do the voting also when they're working abroad or traveling or anything. So that is something which is a sort of, it's like the common example of declaring taxes. We can declare our taxes online. It usually comes pre-filled. And for people who are not doing any investing or don't have any foreign incomes, then usually the tax declaration is 5 minutes. That's because all the employment taxes, all of that is already there, and the Estonian Tax and Customs Board has already pre-filled that form for you, and you can do it on your mobile phone while you're resting in the Caribbean. So that's the idea. You are an Estonian wherever you physically are, or you can be an e-resident wherever you physically are, but you're running an Estonian business. It's sort of a same international global view on how you run things and how you provide yourself, how you interact with your citizenship or e-residence in that regard.
So we're gonna come back to the toolkit for e-voting later, but just to highlight, you mentioned zero knowledge proofs. What other privacy enhancing technologies are incorporated into the e-voting system?
There's mixnets. Mixnets are very helpful if you want to hide the sources of certain, it's like shuffling. It's like shuffling a ballot box. Think of it like that. And there's obviously there's encryption, and probably there's some things more that I don't remember on the top of my head because that protocol was again changed a few years ago, and I just have to admit I don't know it. But you can find the source code on GitHub. That's the nice thing. You can go and find it, and you can technically roll your own voting app if you really want to. And it should be compatible with the backend. And if it is, then you can, compile your own voting app and run it. And you'll get to vote on something you compiled yourself, which is pretty new. Most people still go for the government delivered version for ease, because not everybody in Estonia is very good at building software off of GitHub. We're still working on that, but that was a joke. But the point is that the technologies, there are more and more coming here. And for example, let's just mention blockchain. Let's give a nod to blockchain. Timestamping was, Cybernetica built its first timestamping, linked timestamping service in 1998 or something. That's what's called permissioned blockchain today, I think, or it's very close to that. But timestamping is sort of like a service which tells you that this document existed at that date and time. And we have a timestamp on every digital signature given in Estonia, because obviously you shouldn't be able to backdate your signatures. You can do a lot of fraud this way. And new technologies, we start looking at them, prototyping them, building proof of concepts at a pretty early technical readiness level. So our Cybernetica provided public linked timestamping service, like a notary service, was the second in the world. The first, I believe, was built by Shorty in the United States, and we built the second one. It didn't get much traction back then, because obviously we were a little bit early to the market. Well, these days, there are companies who earn a lot of money by doing something like this, and people are building whole businesses across on top of that. The point of that was that technologies have their place and time, and the privacy technologies are now finding their time. Cybernetica and, well, me personally, I've been doing privacy technology research for the last 15 years. Initially, when we started going around with thoughts like secure computing, multi-party computation, things like that, then folks looked at us and said, this is really awesome research. It will be needed very much in the future. But we couldn't get serious proofs of concepts done. Then around 2011, we got our first real applications. 2016, we got our first governmental applications done using MPC. And now the technology is mature enough that we are putting it on more and more roadmaps for inclusion in the future. And technologies come up all the time. There's data synthesis, and there's trusted execution environments and things like that. They will be implemented based on a business need, I would say. And that here we find an interesting innovation question of, if you have an existing system, but you know how to build a more secure one, then what is the lever? What is a sort of trigger that should inspire you to rebuild your existing system into a more privacy-preserving one? For example, right now, if Estonia started from scratch right now, I think we would have a lot more privacy technologies in the government. So we've already, to some degree, sort of not, I wouldn't say fallen behind, but we're not starting from scratch these days anymore. Now, if we take something, we already have the business logic in place, we have a service in place, but we would need to sort of iterate. And maybe when the next big implementation is done, maybe it is built on secure computing this time. Could be. So the government has been using secure computing for certain analytical studies. There are plans for using it to analyze certain delicate data like mobile phone location data for statistical purposes. Well, obviously, the COVID-19 contact tracing app was based on privacy technologies. The Estonian version was using the Apple and Google implementation, which used Bluetooth and a lot of clever cryptography to ensure that basically the backend didn't really have much data at all. So I would say that this is an ongoing process.
So the public-private partnership that you had with Estonia, Cybernetica had with Estonia, how did it extend beyond e-voting?
I wouldn't say that there's an exclusive partnership that Cybernetica enjoys. We do have a certain reputation and a certain expertise, which is rather unique, but mostly when it's about cryptography. So we've gotten to build a lot of systems. The Estonian e-government, the interoperability system between Estonian e-government services, the X-Road, is initially a Cybernetica design. These days, we are not maintaining its code base anymore. That's now handled by the government, and actually there's a whole Nordic Interoperability Institute which runs this and ensures that it goes in the right direction. But we were the ones who built the first 6 versions, I would say, of that, and also maintained and ran it. Then there's the identity platforms. We've built the cryptographic underpinnings of Smart ID, which is a threshold RSA-based mobile phone authentication and digital signature solution, which is rolled out to 3 million people in the Baltics. I use it to sign employment contracts almost not every day, but every week I sign a few. And that's been something that we have worked on. Various other identity projects, like the original digital, the ID card project, PKI-based ID card that Estonia have. We were related to the pilot of that. And well, we've also been working quite a lot on the systems, the tax and customs systems, for example, and like big governmental access control and identity systems. So it's not only the crypto work, we build all kinds of mission critical software, and we have been a good partner for the Estonian government, and they continue to work with us. And we've been able to transfer this trust to other governments internationally. We have very good collaborations, lengthy ones been going on in Ukraine, also like building the e-governments for African nations of Namibia and Benin, and so on. There's more and more there. So some of the pieces of the Estonian model are easier to export, and others less so. For example, Estonia has something which is called the Population Registry, which some countries consider, well, I would just say heretical. It's sort of a list of every person with an ID. And that same ID is printed on the ID cards that we have. If I'm interacting with the government, then I'm technically proving to them that I'm the person with this ID. Because, names are not a very good unique identifier. Many people can have the same names, but the ID codes are designed to be unique, and you get one when you're born. It's actually to the level that I have 2 kids. When they were born, they were assigned the national ID codes at the hospital. Then I went home. They didn't have names yet. And then I could use a helpful online service to give them names. It works like this, that we figure out what a proper name would be. And then we tell them, yes, this is my kid. These are, I'm trying to name the kid with this ID code. It's all helpfully, they already tell me who my kids are. The form actually shows me, yes, these are your kids. You can name this one. And then me and my wife, we had to digitally sign it. So that's the level of things we do. I named both of my kids online. And got the birth certificates later I sort of picked them up at the municipal government. But it sort of gives you the understanding that not everything we do is immediately transferable, because the concept of a population registry wouldn't fly in most European countries. You can argue that a lot of them actually have something which looks like a population registry. Maybe it's a tax number, or a social number like healthcare, like insurance numbers and things like that, which are actually pretty much the same things. But you can argue that not everybody has them. Then you obviously have to start the discussion of whether everybody needs healthcare and whether everybody needs social insurance or some tax to pay taxes. Usually people need to pay taxes, so they need to have some sort of a tax number. But the public arguments around this is still that ID numbers for people are supposed to be pseudonyms. But in Estonia, they're unique identifying vectors, let's say. And they are not private. In the US, the social security numbers are confidential as far as I'm aware, for example. And in Estonia, that is not the case. You can't successfully impersonate anyone by knowing their ID code. That's where the cryptographic proof mechanisms come in. You actually need to prove that you are the person with this ID code. Just knowing the code or being able to show a document might not be enough to give you a digital access to services. So again, we've built all of this deep from the ground up. We've built a holistic approach to this, and it wouldn't transfer everywhere. If you build a holistic system and you make it a part of your society, then you need to keep maintaining it, and you can't really go back to driving horseback once you've driven a car. If something happens when you fix the car, you don't go back on horseback. So a few years ago, when it turned out that the manufacturer of our ID cards, which are the thing you use for elections or signing documents or naming your kids online, apparently, they had a flaw which meant that their RSA keys were incorrectly generated. There could have been breaches. And the researchers from the Czech Republic alerted us to that. Mathematicians, they had found this. And we had an election coming in like 6 or 7 weeks, which meant that the first question is, do you cancel? Do you delay the election? Do you stop internet voting? What do you do? Panic. So what Cybernetica did back then was we helped the government and other private companies well versed in these technologies to quickly bootstrap on top of the initial ID card hardware new kinds of keys. We swapped RSA keys out and put elliptic curve keys in. The hardware allowed for that, and then we went on. We fixed the car. There was a big issue. There were court cases with the chip providers because it was their fault very obviously. But the thing was indeed that we went and we understood that there is no way back from where we are with this. There is just forward. There is just improving the security. There is adding new privacy features. There is increasing trust. There is reducing single points of failure. That's where we are. That's hopefully that's what you have in mind when you talk about encrypted economy.
Yes. And what about the government and homomorphic encryption? Now, before I even push you on the spot with that, I'll say the U.S. could certainly do a lot more from a governmental level with homomorphic encryption. Particularly, it regulates across multiple financial markets and equities, commodities, futures, all that good stuff. And it has a singular reporting system known as CATS, where everything has to report to a singular database, which, by the way, every single exchange also draws from for its reporting. So you have a lot of different touch points. Compelling case for homomorphic encryption, because obviously that's a huge honeypot. So my question is, does the Estonian government look at homomorphic encryption as a potential solution for preserving privacy within the government, or is that still maybe down the road?
It is down the road, and what we've been building instead on is secure multi-party computation, which is like homomorphic encryption, but in a distributed manner. So for the homomorphic encryption gives you the ability to calculate on ciphertexts, right? Multi-party computation gives you the same thing, but it also gives you a consensus system on what is being computed. And that's an extra. Sometimes if you want to enforce policies, like only calculate these algorithms or these functions, then a multi-party computation might be a slightly more compelling offer. Also, it used to be that multi-party computation outperformed homomorphic encryption by several orders of magnitude for more complex algorithms. This is changing. Just today, I read of a new, very cool preprint on a homomorphic system hardware accelerator, which is making homomorphic encryption number of orders of magnitude faster. And that was a very exciting read. And that might actually change things quite a bit. It will require custom hardware, so it will take time until the cloud providers and everybody deploys this and it actually becomes available as a commercial offering, but still very exciting development. So is that paper public? Yes, it is. It is. It came up just read it this morning on its F1 was the beginning. It came out from a lot of respected folks at MIT and elsewhere. So I believe it comes from the DARPA Homomorphic Encryption Hardware Acceleration Program.
Okay.
That is, but that's really fresh. So we keep ourselves up to date. There's an internal list where people post the cool new things in cryptography, and the company tries to know what's cool. So we built the prototype of value-added tax fraud detection system. This is not totally unlike sales tax, but it gets like taxed at different points in time. And we actually prototyped the system with a tax office in Estonia on trying to make it so that the government would collect certain tax declarations in an encrypted manner and then find fraud, cross-reference and find fraud from them without decrypting them, without learning all the transactions, but finding people who could be avoiding tax. So this was actually, Cybernetica did that pilot with the government using our ShareMind secure computing system. That's the trademark we have for our sort of homomorphic secret sharing multi-party computation system. But that is certainly on the roadmaps, because we've found that given the very deep integration of technology into our society, then we are sometimes being considered as not having any privacy at all, which isn't fully correct. We don't have centralized super databases in Estonia. In fact, all the different government agencies still hold their own silos, and the X-Road platform that Cybernetica designed back in the day was exactly designed to build transactional services on top of distributed databases. That was its whole point. And it's still being used to this day, but what we've found is that the data science and AI applications, which are again becoming a lot more active today, Estonia does have a governmental AI program. They are trying to figure out how to pull all this data together, because that's how data scientists are taught at universities today. You need to have the data in front of you in one location, and then you know what to do with it. Given that we have a distributed data architecture in the government, then obviously we would like to continue having that because it has served us very well. So I see that the government in time will need a distributed data analysis mechanism, or at least a secure computing system based on MPC or homomorphic encryption or trusted execution that will allow you to put data together without putting it together. Or if it is put together, then it's encrypted and there's policy enforcement ensuring that you can't do anything you like with it once you've done it. It does take away power from the data science teams, but that is an interesting discussion which direction the world is going. Whether we're going in a direction like countries like China are taking, when there are social scores to people. It's like credit score, but for everything you do, whether you behave well on the street or whatever. And that's obviously a big centralized system where everybody is being graded on everything they do. Or there is this architecture of distribution. And it might be that in some countries and in some governmental styles, one style wins out over the others. So that is an interesting discussion we will be having across the next few decades on whether all the work that has been done in cryptography on distributed computing, consensus, programmable economy, all the blockchain networks, tokens, all of that, where it will take us. Whether the energy overheads of some blockchain style networks will actually force them to be used less in favor of more centralized blockchain networks. I wouldn't like that, because again, if it turns out that there's a single source of truth on the blockchain and it's controlled by a single organization, then we're not very far off from having a centralized database when you start looking at the trust relations of everything. So a lot of this is actually very exciting, and we hope to play our part in showing that distributed still is the way.
And talking about China's model, they also are pursuing a central bank digital currency, which will also give them much more visibility managing data. It also appears that the U.S. now wants to move in that direction, presumably not with the same designs as China's, but still with the desire to I guess, ensure dollar dominance, and that's probably one of the driving forces, but also to facilitate programmability. Do you see that kind of initiative taking root in Estonia?
The Estonian central bank already has a digital currency R&D program, so we're not much behind on that. And I've been in some of these meetings, and one of the things that I've always discussed there and I've forced there is the question of controlling cash issuing, also removal on the market. And whether you want to have that controlled by a single organization. Today's cryptographic technologies allow us to build distributed networks of control as well, meaning that even by, going as basic as secret sharing or using threshold encryption for keys, you could ensure that no single organization can create new money or remove money from the market, because that would be a pretty big problem, right? So the question is exactly, when we're talking about controlling money, then are we talking about single source controls or multi-source controls? And that's, again, following up from my discussion beforehand, whether we build distributed systems or centralized systems. And governments, which are going to be more centralized, might actually opt for more centralized controls over their central bank digital currencies. Whereas others might actually build actual networks where maybe, in a prettiest future vision, maybe if there's going to be a European Union central bank digital currency, maybe all the nation state, like member state central bank heads, will need to go and turn a key somewhere for actually any cash generation would be possible. So that's sort of where I'm hoping that maybe we can go, because I believe that these are, and that's a great point that has been made by some gentlemen from, I believe, Lunar Ventures, is that privacy enhancing technologies should actually be viewed as partnership enhancing technologies, because not everybody is interested in buying privacy. Well, if you talk to some businesses, then what's this privacy thing? It's this thing the Europeans thought out so they could do protectionistic economy, right? So it depends on your worldview in that regard. But if you want to build proper partnerships, if you would like Wall Street hedge funds to be able to agree on things, on data, everybody puts some data in, everybody gets some sort of market clearing price out, have auctions without having to put their secrets in, then this is a technology that creates partnerships. It's not just privacy, it's a bit more. That's why multi-party computation is, in my view, interesting compared to homomorphic encryption, because of that multi-party control aspect. It achieves the same encrypted computing, but it also gives you a need for some sort of a consensus model.
So this concluded the first part of my discussion with Dan Bogdanov. To hear the rest, please check in a couple of weeks. That episode will be provocatively entitled Privacy Tech, Data, and Nuclear Waste, cueing off the notion that in many cases, while data analysis and the outputs of that analysis is what the enterprise or business wants, what they really want to do is avoid the data itself because of all the regulatory concerns and the privacy concerns associated with it. So in that episode, we talk about the different types of data enhancing technologies, how they are adapting, and how they can greatly enhance business partnerships. We also talk about Cybernetica ShareMind, a secure computing and data analysis platform. We cover a lot of ground on that episode, and I'm sure anybody who's going to listen will learn a great deal from it.